Yes.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Good to be back. Last week.
Hold on just a minute. Good evening and welcome to our Feeder Alignment Committee meeting. Tonight we're going to continue with the conversation with regard to our feeder alignment process and then looking at our next steps. And tonight we're so very happy again to have Dr. Robin with us to talk from the 5 priorities that came out of our last meeting and to look at how those have been integrated and then have that conversation and questions with regard to the process. So at this time, Dr. Robin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Superintendent. So last week, most of you recall the 5 major points that we had to follow up on were around the distance, which Ron shared some data since the last meeting, categorizing by individual student place of residence, whether the student lived within 1 mile, between 1 mile and 1.5 miles, or more than 1 mile from each middle school. So working that into the model and being able to, when we run scenarios, see how it breaks out in terms of transportation. Point number 2 was the number of schools that would change from their current feeder pattern. Number 3 was the idea of using the total risk scores that the district has and creating histograms to show. I made some progress on that. What I did is break the total risk scores down into quintiles. So, 20th, 40th, 60th, 80th percentiles, created 5 groups, and to show graphically how these groups would break out in terms of if students are clustered in higher risk or lower risk groupings. The dual language kids was point number 4, pulling them out as essentially a 12th school or a 12th building, which I was able to do, and accurately it was pointed out that there's some validation that needs to be done on those data. I had the exact same questions as were emailed earlier when I first pulled them. And then there were some questions around the impact of the 5th point, questions around the impact of weighting the data, and whether the model was going to be overly reliant on how you chose to weight or not to weight. So we can start there, and I'll just tell you what I did and then pause and we can field questions or discuss whatever your opinions and thoughts might be. The idea of the weights was, anytime you're aggregating across years, you have to weight data somehow. If you compute a mathematical average, it's just equal weighting. So just based on sort of what I felt our priorities were in this process, the weighting was meant to make current data a little more influential than older data in the model, and to make academic data a little bit more influential than, say, discipline behavior data were in the model. And I felt that made sense, given that the academic data is greater in quantity and in many cases quality, reliability than the other data. And it's academics, it's what schools do. So I thought just practically and philosophically it made sense. There is no, that I'm aware of anyway, sort of precise, you can't ask a computer, how should I weight academics versus discipline versus behavior? It's really a human, like user determined weight based on our collective experience and priorities, as I said. So that was the goal of the weights. And my hope and my expectation was that the weights weren't going to significantly change the order of the schools or drastically alter the, what the scenarios would look like. But there was some concern around that. So I ran the data both with the original weights, which is what you see on this sheet that's called weighted data. And the shaded columns are really the ones that end up feeding into the model. The yellow ones are raw data. And then the green ones are putting the schools in order in each of those domains. We're moving away from the word ranking. In spirit, that's kind of what it is. So the weights are listed here. We can talk more about the dual issue, but the weight for the duals is on row 19. So to accentuate the more current data a little bit, normally actually I would do that more, but since we're only partway through school year 22. I didn't want to overly weight the current data. We also talked about, there's some contextual issues around school years 20 and 21 as well. So for the academic data, these weights are meant to skew things a little bit towards the current. Same for all of the elements of academic data. And then in compiling a composite academic ranking or resource estimate, we're calling it now, the weights were given 40% report cards, 40% NWEA, and 20% state assessments. Again, that's based on our knowledge of working with the data, limitations of the state assessments, the fact that there wasn't a state assessment in 2020, and opt-out issues and changes to the test that we're aware of. For attendance, there's no weighting. I mean, there's equal weighting. For behavior, there's equal weighting. And for the risk scores, it's skewed towards the current students. And you can see the weights there to determine these. So it's just that the weighting is a very simple formula. It's 20%, 20%, 20%, and 40% using these values in rows BG through BJ. And then, and I don't know if this was the one that seemed like it might be the most disruptive, the final order of the schools. And again, this is just one composite equity metric. We're going to keep them separate as well, but so that we have a single metric, and whether or not it's used is really up to people who have decision-making authority. I weighted it 50% academic, and then 20% attendance, behavior, and risk, 15 and 15. Again, that's not based on a statistical analysis or on some program that told me that was ideal. It's based on my knowledge of the data and priorities in my discussions with the administrators at the district. So in looking at how much this changed the scores, changed what the schools look like to us, I was asked to look at different weightings, and without something more specific or a thought of what would make more sense, I took the weights off. So I just got rid of those rows. Everything is weighted equally across time and across domains on this sheet. We don't have to go through and look at this sheet. It's the exact same data, the same rankings and all that. So to make it easy to compare, I just have a weighted versus unweighted sheet here that I sent. And you see each of the domains, report cards, and the UNWA percentiles. If we just say, look at the English weighted versus unweighted, I'm happy, and as I expected, there was minimal change. For something like grades, the one school that you see a more significant change is SPA. When it's unweighted, it goes down, and that's because this year report card grades in SPA have been higher, significantly higher compared to the prior years we looked at. I don't think it's inappropriate to weight that a little more heavily. These are the kids that will be going to the middle school. I don't know contextually if that's, the report card grades going up are performance-based or, policy-based or a mixture of the two, but that's what's happening this year as we head into middle school. So the fact that the weighting skews SPA up a little bit, I don't think is a limitation of the model. If anything, I would say it's a strength. I'm not going to go through row by row, but I sent this around. I don't know if anyone had a chance to look at it. The theme is pretty consistent regardless of which columns you look at. There's not a tremendous amount of change, and the general themes of which schools tend to cluster where aren't affected. So it really just comes down to, do we think it's reasonable or preferable to weight certain data more heavily than other data? These are the final rankings. They change a little bit because, again, now academics is not 50%. The 4 domains are each 25% in determining these rankings. But the domains are highly correlated. They tend to hang together. So even taking that off didn't completely kind of throw a bomb into the mix. So that was point number one of the impact of the weighting. I will pause here and happy to hear questions or thoughts on that piece.
Just, I appreciate the clarity. That was helpful.
Great. So everyone's happy? Fantastic.
0.105.
Do you mind zooming in a little bit?
Do I mind what?
Zooming in.
Oh, a little bit on the file more? Sure. Oh, I thought I had it at 125. I'm sorry.
You also do have it in your inbox. Everyone, the superintendent did forward the actual spreadsheet so that people can manipulate it themselves if you have access to Excel on your desktop.
I didn't realize you have to zoom sheet by sheet. I'm sorry. You were all squinting that whole time.
I did have one question. So there's a specific line here that says weight dual.
Yeah.
Explain that line. How does that part work?
Because, and we'll get to we can go to the dual point next, but because for the duals, I didn't have 4 years of reliable data.
Mm-hmm.
I only had, say, for attendance 2. So instead of 25, 25, 25, those 2 years are weighted at 50.
Okay.
It's just because the data available for the duals was different. We'll get to it, but I have school years 21 and 22 entered for the duals, not 19 and 20. So I couldn't do the same weighting. I had to do something comparable, just having 2 years of data.
That makes sense.
Now, we're not going to get to resolution on the dual piece because as soon as I sent this around, who was it? Was it Dorian who sent some questions? And as soon as I saw those data, I had the exact same reaction. So that's a good sign. I go into the district server. So this is really unmanipulated, unprocessed data. I try to mess with things minimally. It's a good philosophy in life as well as with data. So I pull a demographic file. Working with, Tricia Wolf has told me where to go to find her most current and cleanest information. So I create like a base where I pull demographics for the 4 school years we're looking at, all students, most current enrollment for that school year. And then I have, their IDs, their demographics, and I can aggregate these fields by going in and pulling report cards, NWEA, state assessment, et cetera, and creating a single file that's kind of more comprehensive look at each student. So for duals, there's a student program file. It's kind of a roll-up that has a bunch of programs in it, but there's a dual language variable in that file that's just a 0-1 variable. So I went in and pulled school years 19 to 22, the dual language variable, which is just, a yes, no, and put that into the larger file. I had to code the kids as dual. It matched up with some information I'd received last summer from the Delaware principal. So, that was the one validation check I was able to run on it. But when I just edited the file to 5th graders only, in school years 19 and 20, it was light. There were so few kids that to pull them as a separate group would have been bad data. They were so small that outliers in one way or the other were going to pull the means. The mean was not going to be representative of the group and was not going to be meaningful. So I didn't want to, in an analysis of this size, have a group of less than 10 that was considered as a separate school and a mean that was not meaningful. So my first question was, is there a reason, would we expect that the grade 5 dual language kids would be a smaller group in 19 and 20?
No.
And I guess from the email, the answer to that would be no.
Right.
So I will do some due diligence on that and check with Tricia to see if there's a better source or another file that I should go in. And if I can't get it from Tricia, I'll go to, I don't know if it would be Delaware, or we will track down the person who knows who was in the dual program 1920, 21, 22, and I'll verify that 0-1 variable and make sure we have the right group.
Right.
It's not inconceivable in terms of the data, and I've double checked the data in terms of NWEA report card. Those are accurate. It's interesting that the report card grades are low and the NWEA scores are high. If that turns out to remains after we validate that the dual kids are right, that's something that's interesting, just as kind of a side piece of knowledge from doing all this. The other thing is that it's such a small group that obviously these numbers are going to be a little less stable. Means can be impacted more with a group of 24. And if you look at the dual, it was the school year 21 students who were kind of through the roof on NWEA and NYSED tests. It's only 24 kids. It could have been a good year for dual, or even, if it was a good year for 6 of the kids, that's going to pull the numbers up. So it's possible. But at the very least, we'll check into that. And at the very least, we'll figure out why we don't seem to have enough kids for 19 and 20.
And the 21 data, that's from like NWA spring, or is that from this school year fall?
That is from the end of last school year, spring 21 NWA.
So some of those kids were in a virtual class. They were still dual students, but they were in a virtual non-dual classroom. Other ones were in person. So I see the challenge of pulling them. And just to explain to people because most people didn't see my email, I was appreciative to get this dual data. It was really helpful and interesting. But there were a couple of interesting things about it. One is that the dual test scores for both NWEA and the state test were very high, like 3rd highest in the district. Like it goes Montessori, New Scotland, dual, which is great, but interesting and a little bit surprising. But the report card scores and the report card grades and the district's risk score was super low, like 11th out of 12th. Like it went like dual Giffen in terms of there was risk scores. So that would be pretty unusual to have so many kids considered quite high risk scoring at the very top, which it would be amazing if that were the case. Like, wow, what a great program we've got going. But it really raises the question, like, is this for real or is something else going on here? Are we missing something important in this data? So that was the question I had emailed to Dr. Robin earlier today.
Yeah, I had a whole bunch of thoughts following that email. And one is the risk score has a demographic component to it. So
sure. Got a whole bunch of kids who are English language learners and lots of reasons.
Yeah. Yep. So that would put some points on their risk total, but you're right. You would think if their attendance is high, their discipline's low, their academics in terms of in-class report card wasn't high, but yeah, it was a strange pattern of data. So worth looking into further. You're right.
Well, thank you for doing a little more digging to try to figure out what's going on, and maybe we have something to celebrate there. But if not, it would be good to know that too.
And at the very least, I would like to be able to fill in the rest of the year's data.
Because those classes should have been, similar sizes. There wasn't any big difference.
We'll get to the bottom of that. That's any variable that's 0-1 is not too difficult to fix. So those were the 2 points that.
Just a quick question about the data, which is sort of a dumb question, but it's one that's tripped me up in other data projects I've done. I just want to make sure that I understand. The database that you're drawing from includes all students, whether or not they are still enrolled in the district. It's not limited to only students who are currently enrolled.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I go in school year by school year, and because a lot of IDs are duplicated because a student may have changed schools or enrolled and de-enrolled and came back, Tricia has a variable that is most current or most recent enrollment by school year. For each student. So if I go into the school year 19 file, I can pull every student the most recent information we have on every student who was enrolled in school year 19, whether or not they're still in the district or not. So that's the base file for each year. All right, so that's 2 of the 5 points. And those were the ones I felt best about, so brace yourselves. Okay, now the work I did this afternoon
Dr. Robin, I'm sorry to interrupt you,
Oh,
but just before you get into the next one, I was hoping you could help me understand the scoring for the report card grades. Is it out of a certain number? Is it like normalized data? Like, is it like, does it come in differently and you've normalized it through like 1 through 4 or 5 or something? Or
It's the district records report card grades 1 through 4.
got it. And these are simply averages for the schools for the years pertaining to English and math, period.
Yep. Yep.
Got
That's
And
what
just for everyone else's and my edification, 1 through 4, 4 being the lowest,
no, 4 is the best.
4 is the best. Thank you.
And what it says, I believe, correct me for those of you who get report cards for your kids, 4 is it's sort of above where they're expected to be, 3 is on par for where they're expected to be for their grade, 2 is like needs some help, and 1 is like kid needs a lot of help. So those 2s are like need some help, 3s, we want them all to be 3s, right? And then 4 will be above.
It's really kind of similar interpretation as the state test with levels 1, 2, 3, 4. So.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. So I've made some progress on 2 of the other 4. Now, I was thinking this would be, I'm hoping this would be a useful sheet because, boy, this took me forever. My eyes are still swimming. The grayed out cells are open for manipulation. So they're drop-down menus. You can choose schools. And you can group them however you want. If I switch that to MMS, you'll see like down at the bottom, the group totals for this is the composite ranking, which you can use if you want. Because equity is a priority, I thought it would be good to have a single metric that is a data-driven, reasonable summary of equity. Again, just in the spirit of trying to remove as much as we can subjectivity, gray area, make things as formulaic and quantitative as possible. So if, for example, we're comparing a bunch of scenarios or comparing 2 scenarios, one is better in discipline and attendance, the other one's better in academics. We want to avoid kind of let's go with this one. So to the extent, which I think some of that might be unavoidable, but to the extent possible, if we want to, we can use this as a measuring stick, kind of a ballpark tiebreaker if necessary, or just to give a quick sense of how equal the 3 groups are. This is the end. I can use the ends that are in, I've seen other people's files that have the total number of 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders currently in these schools. This is just the cohort that would be going in September. So this is based on the number of 5th graders enrolled in these schools right now. This is the report card grade total, the NWEA total, state assessment, attendance percentage, the number of discipline counts, that's just a raw number of discipline counts, and this is the total risk score. So on this sheet, you can create any scenario you want. Like I just changed this to MMS. If you watch the group 1 total down there, if I put this, say, on Giffen, you see what the risk score does, and all of these changed as well. So as many scenarios as you want to run, you can run. As far as the distance, the transportation, once you have your groups, you can select which group's going where. Right now, groups 1 going to Myers, group 2 is going to Hackett, group 3 is going to North Albany. If I change this, if you watch these totals, that's the total number of students. This is based purely on the data Ron sent me. If you change this, it'll tell you, whether you get better or whether you get worse. This is the number we want small. I guess that's the number. Secondarily, we'd want smaller. So you can play with the scenarios of where they go, and this tells you by individual student residence where they're going. Histograms of risk scores. There was a couple of looks, and I don't know if we meant for each school, but that's a lot of histograms to ask people to look at. So these change automatically as you change the groups as well. This shows you the risk score quintiles by group. So group 1, this would be like the lowest risk category. The darker red is the higher risk category. So this is 80th percentile and up. This is the full population of total risk scores. You see group 2 has a kind of disproportionate in the 60 to 80th percentile there. The other look I gave is instead of the groups being the columns, the risk categories are the columns. And you can see like in the highest risk category, we're pretty evenly split, group 1, 2, 3. Group 2 is a little overrepresented in 4, et cetera. So if you, well, you get the idea. If I put all of the kind of least resource intensive schools in one group, you would see that group represented here and almost not represented at all in these two. So this is just an automated formulaic way. And if we come down to, you know, a final dozen or a final 20 or scenarios that we seem to like, we can plug them in. They can each have their own sheet, and we can compare them along all of these lines. And, you know, look, we can focus in on the academics if we want to that are here, look at how even they are in these 3 domains: attendance, behavior, and risk. So that's what I did this afternoon. As far as changes from current schools, I haven't built that in yet. I think that's probably the easiest one to do. I can probably I'll code something in so we just have another number come up that tells you, based on the scenarios, how many schools will be going to a different school. And then at least for individual scenarios, hopefully you'd have the most of the important information that you need to assess what you think of the scenario. So that is pretty much what I've got up to this point.
So can I ask a question, Dr. Robin?
Sure.
Just to check my own understanding. Based on this graph, the bar chart you have over here, we want those bars to be as close together as possible based on the groupings of the schools, correct?
Well, there's different numbers of kids in these percentile groups. Well, maybe there's not.
Can I say it a different way, Marina? What I think we
Sure.
want is, and it would help, I think, if right now Montessori is in 2 different schools, so we should fix that just for purposes of the example. We got Montessori in group 1 and in group 3, so if we can just put that back, I think you just did
Coast
it.
is the one, yeah.
So if the schools were the same, the pattern would be the same here, right? If the schools were roughly equal, this
Right.
shape would be the same for all 3. So since the shape is different for each one, it tells us that something's different. Each line's not going to be the same, right?
Exactly.
You're at one school the same, but the shape of each of the 3 should be roughly the same if you were going to have comparable schools.
That's a better answer than I was going to give. Yes, that's right.
And ultimately, though, the darkest graph, the darkest bar, we do not want it to be. We don't want it to be huge in any one of the groupings.
Right.
I think we need to look at the school or district as a whole, though, right? Because let's just pretend that 100% of our kids were high risk, then each middle school would be 100% high risk, right? So what we want to know what the district overall is, and they should all look as close to the district overall as possible. Does that make sense?
Well, this is a local metric. So these percentiles are based on all the 5th grade scores that we had in the district. So this is district data.
These little histograms will change and populate as you change them in real time, right?
Yep.
Can you make a really lopsided one just like right now, just so we can see like what we're avoiding? Can we put like Montessori and New Scotland at the same school? Because I think that will make it really clear for all of us that are like, what are we aiming for? What is,
or maybe even
bad combination?
maybe even sorry, or maybe even what does it look like with our current feeder pattern?
Which should show us some pretty skewed.
All right, so someone's going to have to help me a little bit with this. North Albany is,
Okay, so group 3 is our higher scoring, higher privileged school in the way we got it set up right now.
if I do current feeder, I'm just changing to current feeder pattern.
That's fine.
Is that North Albany?
Spa and Arbor Hill.
So it's easy. So hold on a minute. Let's clarify. Group 1, the way this looks, group 1 would be Hackett. Is that what we're saying? Group 2 would be Myers, and group 3 would be North Albany. Correct?
Okay, yep.
Okay. Now, based on that, the current feeder pattern for group 3, which would be North Albany, Dr. Wilson Turner, the schools that should be in group 3 for the current pattern would be.
Lori just said it. He has it right.
Oh, I'm sorry, Lori.
Spa and Arbor Hill.
So we need to just fix group 1, which looks mostly like Hackett. So let's leave it as Hackett. Toast would be right. Eagle Point would be right. DCS
Just need
would be right.
No,
Switch Spa and New Scotland.
yeah.
Scotland goes to Hackett. And then Myers is Montessori.
Wait, this is, which,
That should be Montessori.
Yep,
Fine.
group 2
And
should be
you have to
Montessori.
add Pine Hills. Pine
And
Hills
Pine
needs
Hills,
to be
yeah.
added to group 2.
Is Giffen and Pine Hill in group
There you
2?
No, DCS was good. Oh, you had it there twice. Well, then something's missing because there's only 11.
Dual.
Each
Dual stays with
Dual.
group 1 because up
Fine.
until now they've
Jumping.
gone to Hackett.
so
You just-
dual should be in Hackett?
Yep.
Dual should be in Hackett. That's where they are now.
So you see, that's a little out of whack. Yeah, I mean, the NWEA, that's a very significant difference. Attendance about 3 percentage points lower. Disciplines, and that's where you don't want to, that's in, I think things are getting better as far as standardization of discipline reporting, but when you go back years, it seems like in some locations, disciplines are more likely to be reported than others. So in this case, it's the smallest group by far, so per student is probably a little bit higher than the others, but you still are lower there. And then predictably, the risk score is close to 8.
And can you scroll down so we can see the column, the other view?
Yep.
Okay. Just
So-
to see which.
This is the lowest risk category. That's, of all the students who are in the lowest risk category, that's the percentage that are in group 3.
Right.
Now, this is a little misleading because the group is so much smaller. This is just raw numbers. So this high risk group is roughly split evenly, but if you double the size of that, percentage wise, it's probably close to twice as much in group 3.
So I personally find that top group, that top visualization easier to see what's going on. But at least on my screen, it's shaded from sort of pale peach to dark brown, and that should not be the colors we go with. Let's make them light blue to dark blue or green or purple. Let's not make them human skin tones because that's for obvious reasons. We don't need to fix that right now. That's just a thought for the future. Beautiful.
Ask and you shall receive. There you go. So I guess,
but I'll let questions for a while. Well, let me see if other people have questions. I've done a lot of talking.
This is Talia. So I know you were saying that the number is how it would feed in based on current population. Is there a way to kind of have a baseline for what like Hackett's number will be without those new students? Like I'm not asking to get like the total census of what it would be, because then it would be harder to do manipulation. But like right now, if we look at group 3, the way it is on the screen, so I want to know what is the number that in my head I'm looking at. So as we change this as we manipulate these different groups, so we can start to consider what are the potential total census. So not necessarily adding it here, but maybe making a notation somewhere that like whatever's in, what is that, 36C, whatever's in 36, 37, 38C, we would know it's this number plus this as we're looking at it. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
And yes, so you're thinking to get a total of the students who will be in grades 7 and 8 in these schools next year?
Yes, and just have that noted somewhere, not necessarily to change or manipulate, just to have that somewhere. So as we're changing the different groupings, we for ourselves will know that, if we're saying that it's 400 kids currently, there's going to be 400 kids, in grades 7 and 8 at North Albany next year. However we manipulate the different numbers, we know to add 151 plus 400 as we're thinking about it. So, and I don't know if we have that info now, but that's how we could take into consideration when we're, making different columns, just to make that notation somewhere.
I'm not sure I'm understanding, because I'm thinking that are you looking for like the total school size when all is said and done? Is that what you're asking about?
Yes. So the total school size when all is said and done would be total number of what we expect to be seventh and 8th grade next year. That if that number is sort of solidly noted, so I'm using 400 just as an example for North Albany, no matter how we manipulate group 3, we would then know whatever number shows up in 38C, we know to always add that to 400.
So I think there's 3 ways. Let me see what I'm trying to say. 3 years from now, the total school size would be those 3 numbers times 3, right? Because eventually the elementary schools are roughly the same number of 5th graders each year. So by when all is said and done and we get through the feeder pattern transition period, the school size would be 246 times 3, 248 times 3, and 151 times 3 on this sample. But what you're suggesting is there's going to be 2 years intervening where the enrollment is a little funky, where we have this next year it would be the 7th and 8th graders plus the incoming 6th graders. The next year it would be just the existing 7th graders, who by then will be 8th graders plus 2 years of these guys. So that math is not particularly hard, but in your head, the like 3 times what's there now is where we're aiming ultimately.
Okay.
So I think
I can use that in terms of.
I was going to say the same thing that Ilya said. You
want to see the times 3?
If you take the current 6th graders and 7th graders in each school and just keep that as a placeholder, and you take these numbers and keep adding it to that, so you know that the overall size is going to be about the same, because you don't want crowding in 1 or 2 years in 1 or 2 schools as you're doing the feeder pattern.
Right. So keeping those
3 years from now, it'll be all 3 times this. But
right.
in the interim,
North Albany is going to ramp up to the size of the other 2 over the next 3 years. But as long as these numbers are held close, then year by year, the same number of students are going to feed into the schools. And as we talked about, we do need to leave a little extra room for the dual program to expand. So that's Hackett, right? We want that to probably be a little lower than the other 2 in these numbers.
Hackett right now.
We're not presuming it's Hackett.
That's right. That's right. Well, wherever dual goes, we want that to leave a little room for expansion if we can in that building. That's correct, right?
Or should we just count dual's numbers right? Should we just double dual right now and work with it as if it's 44 instead of 22 or whatever number you've got in there?
I like the Dorian model only because that allows those weighted averages at the bottom to reflect the dual numbers, unless you think that's dangerous, Dr. Robin.
It's assuming consistent performance by the duals, and let's clean up the dual data first. We could do that. I mean, look, obviously there's assumptions built into this. There's no way we could not. Would that dual number be 44, or did you say that there'd be, so it's going to double in size?
Yeah,
That's
it will double.
Okay.
I mean,
can
in
do that.
theory, it will become 48, but clearly you have got 22 right now. I think that class thinks it has 24, but what doesn't matter? We're close.
So for the composite, our goal is to get those 3 composites as close to each other as possible, ideally.
Yes. That seems to, and then that should be reflected in the numbers to the right. If those numbers are far apart, the numbers to the right are probably not going to line up very well.
One of the things I found helpful when we were doing it before was to look at the range. So if you take for NWEA, for example, the smallest number minus, or the largest number minus the smallest one, that way aiming for that to be 0, right, is another way of thinking about it. I don't know how you feel about that, but it was an easy way for me to see for each column D, E, F, G, H, and I. If you look at the range, the narrower the range, the closer to equitable I perceive the scenarios to be. Does that seem right?
Yes, I'll add that. I just wrote range there to remind myself. Obviously, because the biggest and the smallest number will be in different places depending what we code. I just have to write something in so it computes it.
Maximum minus minimum, and then that's the range. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So I'll do that when we're done.
Dr. Robin, I'm also wondering if you are going to be looking at different demographic groups like our students with disabilities and our English language learners when we think about balancing out our schools.
When we zero in on a smaller number of scenarios, I think yes. That's not hard to do. We hadn't talked about building it into a model previously, but that's, I mean, if everybody thinks we should, we could.
Is it counted right now in the risk score if you're using the at-risk dashboard?
Yes, both as students with disabilities and ELL are factors in the risk score.
I think
And
it
then
would be a little.
Enrollment-wise, it should balance out in terms of our self-contained, because if we place a certain number of self-contained classrooms at each building in a balanced way.
And just keeping in mind, the programs will shift at the school based on the needs of the student. So by it being captured in the at-risk score, would we not be addressing it? And I guess I'm saying the same thing. Would it not be addressed at least in some way through the at-risk score? Because we have to be able to change programs based on the needs of the kids in the school.
Yes, it's factored in, but there are so many things factored into the model. It's not inconceivable that something would go out of whack, which is why, you know, my response to Lori is if we start to really think favorably on a smaller group of models, it doesn't hurt to just check. There probably won't be too crazy out of line because of the way all the controls that are built into this. But yeah, we don't want to move ahead on something without just making sure on numbers of ELL, students with disabilities, et cetera, and anything else that we want to look at.
Dr. Robin, I'm curious whether this strategy would be worth our while to look into. So if there are 12 schools and we want to break them into 3 groups, there's the 5,000 something combinations, right? And we could probably cut a large amount of those down based on incompatibility with like school population and things like that. But I'm wondering, is there a way that we can automate that process so we can say we are looking for schools of roughly the same size and a pattern for this, you know, with this histogram risk category group that kind of matches, each group matches each other.
So
Yes.
I'm sorry, Dr. Robin, I'm just going to interrupt. If that's something that you need, just like the brute force computer algorithm for, that's basically the same process I went through previously with Dan's, where I mimicked the math in a way that it could do that for all possible combinations. So that's something I can help with if it's valuable to you.
I was going to bring you in and before you spoke. I got to look at the Excel file that you shared, and that's a lot of work. That's
I could take what you have here and model it that way relatively quickly. Once you've done the how to make it work, for me to make it work for for all the possible scenarios, that part's relatively straightforward.
For efficiency's sake, kind of getting back to the point of there's hundreds of thousands if you don't have any rules or prerequisites. We have several, I think. We just would have to kind of determine which ones we for sure kind of what are non-starters, right? Like, are the 3 schools at the bottom absolutely going to go to 3 different places? Are there certain schools where we're going to say they have to feed into a specific school? I don't know. But algorithms, obviously, and computers work with rules. So I think you had said last week, there will be no more than 5 schools that change or 4 schools that change where they're going? If that's a rule.
I wouldn't want to start with that assumption. I'd want that to be a final thing only at the very end, because I think the board's directive, I think, was as equitable as possible, right? So if this is the kind of conversation we had last time, if changing all 12 schools made a substantial difference, we'd have to really grapple with that. I don't think that's how it's going to come out, because really, you're going to change 5 schools and you're going to get to that same result. But I think presupposing that makes it sound like we're aiming for maintaining the status quo, and I don't think that's our goal. So I think we should let that fall out.
That's important to know. Yeah, I didn't know that. So Anne, and yes, I do need that kind of just raw computing power. I'm very much more an analyst than a programmer. So like my wheelhouse is more when you have a kind of an amount of scenarios you can wrap your arms around to build models like this and run this kind of thing. If you let me know what you need and we could work together so you could run whatever we could set the top 20, the top 30 scenarios that establish equity, then we can look at those other transportation and like changes considerations among like the ones that rise to the top with equity as the priority.
Yeah, that seems like something we could do. Basically, what I would do is I would take your example here and I would create the way that I would have to do it to make the computing work, so that it was like a test case to make sure that my math was the same as your math, and then we'd run it on all the possible scenarios, and that's pretty straightforward for me to do. Obviously, I'd have to do it in a way that you could adjust it as you revised your thinking around dual and all that, which is no problem. So I'm happy to do that. If that is not what you've done here, that's the big work. The rest is just sort of like, computing.
That Excel file was all you, though?
Yes.
I love this powerhouse team. We've got the right skills in the house. I feel very lucky that we have the 2 of you with different but complementary skill sets to do this work. We're very, very lucky. I had a question. Yeah, amazing team. But now I forgot my question. I'll think of it in a minute. Oh, I know what my question was. So Dr. Robbins mentioned a couple of times the idea that there may be some specific parameters, like this school can only go to this school or cannot go to that school or whatever. I don't think the committee is aware of any specific rules or limitations like that. But if there are some, I guess this would be a good time to have that conversation.
I'll chime in. I think one of the things that we wanted to look at with regard to equity was when you look at, for example, we're an educational institution, so we definitely want to look at the academic performance of our students. And so in order to be able to balance out resources and balance out the support of our students with our faculty and staff and even our wraparound services, we wanted to make sure that just like as we're running scenarios that you know, we are not putting all high performing in one school and all low performing in another. And I think those are the things that we just very high level. I mean, I don't necessarily have to go into specifics, but just thinking that that needs to be a consideration where, and I'll just pick an arbitrary number, maybe well, we only have 12, but I'll just pick a number just for example's sake, maybe the lowest 5 schools would not be in the same middle school. And I don't know if the number needs to be 5 or 3 or 2 or whatever the case may be, but there has to be some consideration with regard to that in order to, number one, be able to deliver quality instruction and use the strategies and resources within the building in a very efficient way.
I think that almost has to fall out though, right? If we decide that if we're aiming for the smallest range between the schools possible, by definition, you wouldn't end up with the lowest 3, 4, or 5 at the bottom, because that would lead to a very broad range in middle school. So I think we don't have to pre-establish that as a rule, but it would naturally flow from the rule, which is that we're looking for balanced schools. I think. If it doesn't, then I think we'd have to revisit our model, actually, right? Like if we get it, if at the end of the day, one of the top scenarios had, say, Montessori New Scotland and Eagle Point at one school, and Sheridan, Toast, Schuyler, and Giffen at another school, we'd have to really question what was wrong with our model, because we know that can't possibly be resource appropriate in terms of the way our students would be distributed.
And I guess that's why it's also a good plan. Sorry to
And I know that this is go ahead.
I don't know who's speaking, either Talia or Dorian. I think the two of you were trying to say something.
Go ahead, Talia.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pausing for Dorian. Go ahead, Dorian.
I was just going to say, I think that's why our plan is a good one, to come up with a smaller, a manageable number of excellent, very equitable scenarios, and then look at them with our human eye to double check them and make sure, and look at those things that maybe we can't put into numbers. Go ahead, Talia.
Yeah, I was only going to say, you know, not only agreeing with what's being said about the importance of the academic, and I hear where the population size might be.
Talia, you are breaking up.
up.
You're breaking up, so we're not catching the last part of what you're saying. We're still not able to hear. I know you're muted now, but we're still not able to make out.
If you could put it in the chat, if it's chat worthy or chat, not like a paragraph or something, I don't know.
Or
And I don't know, I can't identify who's trying to speak now. So if she's putting that in the chat, are there any other comments?
I just had a thought, maybe just as like my own kind of, I could experiment on this on my own, but could we potentially I'm going to continue. Can we potentially just model out so that, for example, we could take risk category 1 and say we want this to be as equal as possible across the 3 groups, and then maybe go to risk category 2 and say equal across the 3 groups, with the same risk category 1 being the same. Could we go like step by step and kind of try to get them all to be equal?
Is everyone's audio strange?
Is my audio broken?
No, I heard
No,
that
I can
question.
hear
So-
you. It's just there's some other weird feedback out.
Well, I'm done. That was
Potential,
My
population size, you know, in the
Talia is still coming through very sparse.
It's like a delayed Talia. It's like what she said before is finally coming through and sounding like she's talking now, but I think it's just what she said before.
So Dr. Robin, did you want to try and respond?
After this sort of spreads itself. I'm breaking up. I'll put it in the chat.
Yes,
help.
please.
so,
So Dr. Robin, did you want to go ahead and try and respond to member Almanyawe?
sure. My one hesitation with that being like the driving force behind the whole model is we spoke a little bit last week. The total risk score is appealing in that it has all these components to it, but we don't know how flawed a metric it is. It's locally derived, it's useful, but we don't know, it's not like psychometrically tested, reliability, validity. So to start with that as like that's a component of the model now. It's like 15% of what we're defining as equity. That approach makes it basically 100%. If you just say like, well, the first thing we're going to do is even it out by who's in group 1. Now all our eggs are in the risk score basket.
I wouldn't say
that to me would be risky.
I wouldn't say it's a first step or the total. I am just genuinely curious what it would, how many scenarios would come out of it. And I mean, it would obviously adjust the other numbers. We would be able to see the other numbers as well. The other numbers would change the test scores and grades, etc.
Well, we'll have the visual.
When I take what you've done and I put it in the sort of database format, what I would look to do would be to calculate those ranges, like you just said, and minimize the ranges across all the metrics, right? That's what I think we're defining as, I think, and that's something, Dr. Robin, I may need some feedback from you. Like once I've done this calculation for 5,000 scenarios or whatever, how do we decide which ones float to the top? Is it just that whatever you called the ranking thing, the composite, just sort them by composite, or do we try and create some minimal range, some whatever criteria for the minimum range for each of those other columns?
It's those kinds of rules. Yeah, I mean, a thought would be that we decide the composite has to be within X. The range has to be as little as this. And we see how many scenarios that gives us. And we can adjust that number based on how many we want, basically. Once we have that set, whether it's 50 or 20, whatever number is best, then we can kind of say these pass the equity muster, which is our most important filter. And then among these, let's look at how many kids are going to live within a mile and a half. Let's look at how many schools are going to change. Let's look at the total populations of the schools. And because we essentially would be saying we've established equity to a degree that satisfies us, then we can move on to those secondary considerations.
So let's, I think, Hassan, it will be clear once we get to the next iteration of this, how that would work, where you'll be able to sort of narrow down the available scenarios, the ones that work.
I'm thinking we might be surprised how few there are. Once, like, that really makes sense. Given the size of the schools we need and that we have to split the most resource intensive schools. Well, maybe I'll be wrong, but I think we're going to have a manageable number when all said and done.
I have a quick question. The histogram has 5, so you're just taking the risk factor and dividing it into quintiles?
Yep.
Okay. Does it need to be quintiles? Can it just be quartiles? To make the pattern simpler is what I'm saying. So it's sort of mimicking a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4.
Scores, you mean? Like school heady kind of concept?
The quintiles, I don't know why I liked 5 groups better than 4. There's no reason that it's a little bit more specific. Obviously, smaller groups, you break students out, but quartiles are perfectly reasonable. If that's the preference, no problem.
No, I'm asking. Because at the end, would that make it simpler to see equity between the different patterns? Or are we going to be looking at, small changes here and there that just complicates the situation, where those small changes could be, all collapsed down to a much more simpler?
4 is a little simpler than 5, but it's up to, I'll do whatever the group
I guess
decides.
I'd look to the instructional leadership to talk about that. Like, I don't really have a sense of which students are the most resource intensive. Is it the bottom 20% that are the most resource intensive, the bottom 10% that are the most resource intensive, the bottom 30%? I really don't know where the resource ramps up so considerably, and so I would look to instructional staff to give us some guidance on the operational impact, because that's why we care, right? Because we
Thanks.
really
Your question, or your explanation just made my question more meaningful. That's what I was getting at.
Well, I think we can still see, and I guess, I would ask Cecily and Laura to chime in as well, but I know for me, looking at it the way it is, I can clearly see how we would need to delineate those resources, and that smaller delineation does help, meaning larger in this case. So it really and truly, I know from my vantage point, looking at it the way it is, it helps me. But Cecily and Lori, you guys would be dealing with this information much more closely.
All right, I'm hoping I'm still on and not frozen. I've been out like 6
You are
times. On. So to Dr. Robbins' point, the quintiles give you a smaller band in which to look at. And so we have a tendency to look within the band as much as possible, just because you have a large variation that may sit in there. And so sometimes those smaller bands will give you a better sense of that variation. It's something we use with NWEA a lot to determine where students fall in those buckets. And then when you think about the level 1, 2, 3, 4 on the New York State assessment, and you think about what the raw score looks like and what the range of that can be for a student in that level, it just creates a larger range. So I can see it either way, but I do think the quintiles gives you a smaller bite of the data and a smaller picture of who sits in that bucket, and may be able to provide a more narrowly focused resource group than capturing kids in a larger quartile who may not need those resources.
So in those quintiles, is the first one the more riskier or the last one the more riskier?
The last one.
Okay, so if I was to just look at this image that is right now that you had displayed with what we have, the status quo, Hackett, Myers, and North Albany, they would seem to be, the last 2 columns are about the same, mostly, right? Just trying to understand this. Can you pull up your spreadsheet again?
Oh yeah, let me share again. Are we back?
Yep.
This is the one you meant?
Right. So this is what we have currently without any before the feeder pattern. So the high risk groups, which are towards the right, are about the same, with the North Albany being a little lower.
The problem with this is that North Albany hasn't grown yet. If this was done by percentages, it wouldn't look like this. It's done in raw numbers because ultimately that's what resource requirement is going to be based on, especially once the school's numbers are even. But if this number up here was 250 instead of 150, it wouldn't look balanced. And the
So if
gray,
you just double that for, you know, we just double that saying, you know, assume 2 years from now, yes, that's going to be double the number.
so the highest number of kids would be group 5 would be the highest number of kids in the 5th percentile would be in group 3 once those schools were equal size.
Okay.
And you can see that, I mean, these are the mean risk scores by group. So that's going to kind of give you a good sense of how it's going to lay out in these graphs, if you assume even sample size.
So I wanted to chime in and see if Ms. McKenna had any other comments, and then we have a question in the chat from Talia that I wanted to make sure that we address. So Ms. McKenna, did you have anything to add?
No, I'm in complete agreement with Cecily.
Okay. So the question from Talia, she was wondering if there is a benefit to running some of the previous scenarios through this, or would that be unnecessary with what President Savage would be able to do? And I guess to piggyback on that, would not some of those scenarios be captured anyway, based on how we are expanding and incorporating those scenarios would be captured anyway?
Yeah, what I can do is mark them. So, you know, there'll be like a gajillion scenarios, and I will flag the ones that align to the scenarios, any scenarios that you guys want. Like if somebody can send me the scenarios that you ran that you thought were the ones that were the most productive. I remember at the end, you guys ended up with scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I know which ones those are, and I can just flag those as scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you can see where they are among the other ones. But if there's any others beyond those 4, I just need to know what the scenarios are, and I will I can tag them for you so you can.
We can send that directly to you.
So,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Bill, we can't hear you.
Okay, I'll type it in. Thank you.
Okay.
I mean,
Yahweh.
If people wanted to quickly see.
I actually just wanted to ask about the variance in school size. Like, what are we comfortable with? Maybe that's like a good place to start. So like, if it was completely divided totally evenly, what is the number? And then say, what are we willing to accept in terms of differences in school? Is it 50? You know, is it 60? And then maybe think about the space in each school and what school could potentially take a little bit more.
So historically, we've been looking at, you know, as I've been looking at the number of students per grade level at each of our middle schools, the magic number for me is no more than 210 students per grade level, which would give you about 105 students per team. And when we start getting much larger than 105 or 210 students per grade level, it really becomes challenging when you start to look at class sizes, especially in the core subjects, and then you get up above over, you know, 25 students. So that becomes a real challenge. So my recommendation is to stay right around 200 to 210 students per grade level as we project 3 years out when we finally get to that the full implementation of the new feeder alignment pattern. My second thought is the question was, which school can afford to have more students in their building? Again, I think, you know, from a brick and mortar perspective, it's probably Hackett and Myers that can have additional students beyond that. But educationally and socially emotionally, I wouldn't look to add more than the 105 students per grade, per teams, for a total of 210 students across any of the 3 middle schools.
Well, I mean, but is that like a hard line? So like, could we go like 190 to 225 or 230, like, is there?
Can I ask a question before you get to that question? Because just based on the ends that Dr. Robin has used here, I just added up the 212 plus 213 plus 220 that he's got showing on the screen, and then multiplied by 3 to get you to the full school size, and that gets you 1935. Divide by 3 puts you at 645 students per school if you were 100% perfectly even, which is larger than your 105 per team times 6 teams, right? Which would only bring you to 630.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not going to be able to get down to every school being 630 unless you make some pretty big assumptions about how many students are going to middle school TCCE, which is something we haven't built in yet.
Right, and we take a look at 15 per building for that. Usually it's, we don't count in our 6th grade students because we don't offer TCCE to our 6th grade students because they're just entering the middle level. Comfortably without, raising, really, red flags, we could have 110 per team. I would not, from an educational perspective, go higher than 110 per team, which would give you 220. So the range would be between 105 and 110 students per team at each grade level. So 220 would be my maximum that I would like to see at each middle school per grade level.
So that gets to that. That's where you guys, with the committee, got to the maximum school size of 660 in the first place.
Yeah, 650 is what we really consider.
650.
Right, and I think the question Hassan asked, which is the other question, is the range of schools. Like if you do 650 times 3, that's beautiful, right? That's exactly the best we could hope for, I think, under this scenario. But I think Hassan's asking, must it be 650, 650 to 650? What about 645, 645, 660? Like, are we going to allow a little bit of spread, or are we just going to say, man, we're going to be as tight as we can on everything, within 5 students of each other, because that will radically reduce the number of reasonable options versus if you allow, say, and it also, I think, really depends on what assumptions you're making about enrollment. I want to go back and look at these ends that Dr. Robin has used and see why that seems a little high to me versus our existing enrollment. But that, because that also doesn't account for the doubling of dual, right? Because there's an additional 60 students, 20 students times 3 grades that needs to be fitting in here. And that's way higher than our demographic reports are suggesting our middle school enrollment will be. So something's out of whack there. So we need to figure that total N universe out as well.
So I think in the end, we're looking at 650, and I don't think that we were looking at any variation, because instructionally, we know based on research, based on the data, based on what we see in terms of delivery of quality instruction, those are the numbers that we need to do. We've done that, and we've had those discussions. And so to try and say that somebody can go a little bit above 650, we're in those situations now, and we see what's happening. Yeah, I mean, so I'm not sure that I'm understanding about the flexibility and how much flexibility we would have. So I don't understand that.
I'll explain it then, because it's not about that. It's about the pure math based on the number of students that Dr. Robin has here.
Mm-hmm.
You just add up the number of students. He's got 1,935 students here. So if they were perfectly split, they'd be at 645, 645, 645. So it's not about, we're never going to be
perfect.
If one school lower than 645, the next one would be higher than 645. And all of those schools are higher than what Lori actually would prefer, which was, I can't remember what, 620 or something. So let's run it and look at it, because I think we're getting caught up in a lot of hypotheticals here that are not going to be relevant.
Because we're going to have, there's going to be some, I mean, we're not going to have exact numbers, and I do understand that. But I do know where we would like to be. And so when we're talking about running scenarios and running the formula and having that algorithm, we want to be as close to what we said we thought, felt, and believed based on the research, based on the data. We want to stay as close to that as possible.
And
Now,
the
the
only
reality is when the kids come, we may have some variation, but what we're hoping is that that variation is not, 400 kids here and 700 kids over here.
But can we actually define what is acceptable for us? What range of at-risk and NWEA and state tests and all of that? What is an acceptable range for us to be looking at because of variation, right? For each of these parameters, what do we think is okay? So that doesn't run a bajillion models, but we know how to narrow it down. I think that's the part that for the committee was rather difficult to do. Like, what is the acceptable range both academically and for us? And like, we did it for NWEA, right? That's what we did for the test scores, but then not for anything else. And we want to I would like to see us define that.
Well,
but don't you think it was helpful once you saw the numbers and you saw how things played out to see what that acceptable range might be?
I mean, one question is, what's the minimum possible range, right? So I can run, like, if you take, here's how I'm envisioning this thing happening, because this is what we did before with the less sophisticated model than what Dr. Robin has provided. You take all the scenarios, all the possible scenarios, of which there are literally hundreds of thousands. And then you do what Hassan just described, which is you look for the minimal number of enrollment variation, right? You keep your schools as close to each other as you can. That cuts you down very quickly to, like, I don't know, 5,000. I'm making that number, but let's call it 5,000. Then you can run this math that Dr. Robin has provided on every single one of those 5,000 scenarios. And then you can look at the ranges and say, of those which are plausible, I called those plausible scenarios the first time I did this because they're plausible from an enrollment variation perspective. And you can say, with all of these 5,000 scenarios, what is the range of ranges? Like, what is the tightness possible that we can have for NWEA scores? What's the tightness possible we can have for grades? What's the tightness possible we could have for attendance? And then look to minimize all of those things. And then see, as Dr. Robin says, hopefully there's a fairly small number of them that are minimal on all of those categories. And so that's what I would think we'd be able to come back with next time.
So overlay all of it.
I'm sorry. The other thing I just want to say is that I don't think that we should get hung up right now on those numbers, on the enrollment numbers that Dr. Robin is sharing. I think it's important to develop the scenarios, but historically, when you look over time, not all of our 5th graders feed into a middle school. We have some families who choose to send their child to a private or parochial school, for example, for a middle school. So when you look at our middle school 6th grade enrollment right now, we have 96 graders at North Albany. We have 180 at Myers, and we have 190-ish at Hackett. I may have Myers and Hackett reversed, but we don't even have that 100, even reaching that 100 right now. So I think, if we set that range comfortably at 220 per grade level, that gives us that flexibility that we know that we need, because we know that, when I look at the data as of today, we're not even at 100 per team.
So Lori, Dan Katz asked me a really insightful question about that exact thing a while back, and I've never seen data about this. I know anecdotal, but not data, which is if we're basing all of our equity decisions based on a weighted average of students, right? Everything Dr. Robin has done to get to this, is this middle school scenario equitable, is based on a weighted average of the number of students versus the NWEA, the average NWEA score or the average grade level. If the students who leave the district are disproportionately in some group, let's say they're high performers, or they're disproportionately from 1 or 2 schools, we would be affecting the outcome of our equity map model if we don't account for that. Does that make sense in terms of how the math works? So I hear you, and we do have, although I looked at it in the demographic reports where they gave us both 10-year and 4-year survival ratio averages, it was not what I expected. I expected to see this big drop off between 5th and 6th grade, and I did not see that. I'd have to go back and pull that. It was a while ago that I looked at it, but there wasn't like a big drop. But so I've never seen school by school scenarios, survival ratios to know if that's really true, or if that there's a disproportionate, or if we lose enough kids to say charters and Catholic schools and privates that it kind of washes out over the end. I don't know, and I don't know how we get to that.
If I remember right, Anna, it was like 94 point something percent. So that does give you some wiggle room if historically that's the percent of the outgoing 5th graders who are in seats in the 6th grade. If it's really disproportionate by school, that does kind of throw a wrench into things. But if it's based on high performers, low performers, if it's based on some of the characteristics that we've built in, then this model should protect itself fairly well. If we create even schools, that the types of students, whatever it might be, who are more likely to leave the district after 5th grade should be spread out the same way they're spread out in every other way. But if there's some reason there's like a couple of schools that the kids tend to leave, which I don't know, that because the school's the unit, yeah, that would be a problem.
Would it be possible with the data, and I don't know if this would be worth the effort, but would it be possible to say, look at the student IDs of all the students who were in the district in 5th grade last year, and now look at all the student IDs of the students who are in the district for 6th grade this year, and then calculate which 5th graders are not there anymore, and then group them by school and take a percentage, and then we'd actually be able to answer that question? Is that a plausible thing to do?
Yes.
It has to be pre-pandemic, though. It has to absolutely be pre-pandemic. Otherwise, we're looking at data that is completely out of whack.
18 versus 19, for example, just to get the proportion school by school to see if that happened. So could we do that?
Yes.
I love it when people give one-word yes answers. That's like my very favorite. So if you can figure out the proportion of each school that tends to leave, I can bake that into the overall model in order to build the enrollment projections more accurately.
And then can I just raise another concern that I have too? I know we've been having a lengthy conversation around the academics, the weight of the academic piece of an achievement versus behavior. But again, I'm going just to speak from experience over the last 7 years in the school district, and I know that Cecily can speak to this as well. We know that there's a high correlation between student behavior and academic success. And I see Dr. Robbins shaking his head. And so, in my professional opinion, I think we need to carefully look at the weight of the behavioral challenges and the data that we have, and really take that strongly into consideration as we're looking at these feeder alignment patterns. So I just wanted to voice my concern around that.
So Lori, do you feel, based on your professional experience, that the current model, which Dr. Robin has 50 for academic, 20 for attendance, 15 for behavior, and 15 for risk, which incorporates that's too skewed on academic? Is that your thinking, or is that about right?
No, I agree. I think it's skewed. I think we need to increase the behavioral percentage or weight, increase it more than 15%.
Yes, I 100% agree with that as well. I would like to see more towards behavior and, honestly, attendance.
I agree with that, because if we don't have the kids in school, academic achievement and success can't happen, right? And we know right now
it's about 50% academic and 50% non-academic, including attendance, behavioral, and risk. So I guess I'm going to leave that. My preference is to leave that to the professionals to come back to that. Like, I don't feel like as a layperson, I can really speak to which weighting. I know Dr. Robbins did it both weighted and unweighted and said it's not a huge impact. So
well, that's what I was going to say. I'm not going to dismiss those concerns at all, because I mean, Laura, you're in the buildings every day. I would say when you took the weights off completely, it didn't change things that much. So if I were to say go from 15 to 25% for attendance and behavior, it would have a much smaller impact than removing the weights completely. I can do that, but the model allows you, as you see on the sheet, we're going to have a specific number by grouping of discipline counts, and we also have the percent of the population with discipline incidents. I mean, it'll be a priority to hold that number steady to the extent possible, the same as we do everything else. I don't see a scenario rising to the top where one building has, 200 discipline incidents coming in. So, I mean, we can play with the weights, but I just think being aware all of these domains are really important. And the composite, along with looking at each domain, is meant to, hopefully, out of 500,000 scenarios, there'll be a few where nothing is really out of whack.
Right. So in that sense, each one has 100% weight, right? In the ideal scenario, each factor would be within an acceptable range. Yeah. So the range between the least, this is going to sound like a terrible phrasing, but I can't think of another way to say it. The least well-behaved middle school and the best well-behaved middle school is going to be a very narrow range. Just like the least academically successful and most academically successful would be in a narrow range. That's the hope, is that once we go through this process, we'll be able to come up with at least one, and hopefully more than one, scenario that are very tight ranges for all factors.
In terms of discipline of behavior, is there any way to look at, instead of incidents, but rather number of students with behavior incidents? Because oftentimes, and I've heard this at the middle schools across work and here, that it oftentimes is a group of students that has repeat incidents, discipline incidents, and I'm wondering if there is a way to account for that, so that it's not. I mean, I'm not sure where I'm going, but I'm wondering if there's a way to factor that in.
Like, you want unduplicated incidents, and you want to know, out of the 100 incidents, how many students are making up those 100 incidents.
That's a great
no, it's built in.
Is it built in because it indicates that it requires a different kind of approach to discipline and support, right? To social emotional supports.
Yeah, that gets at that question we talked about last time of, is it a deep and narrow problem or a wide and shallow problem? So for each of these, in behavior and attendance, there's a continuous variable built in, which is the discipline count in this case, which is what we're looking at in the calculations page. But built into the model itself and the composite score is also this categorical, the percent of students in the school with at least one discipline incident. So if there is, a couple of kids who've got 30 incidents each, this number will be low, even though this number could be high. So there's that tries to get at somewhat build in some of what you were talking about, to at least look at discipline in two different ways: how much raw in total, and then what percent of the student body is contributing to it. And we have the same with attendance. We have the attendance percentage. And we also have what percent of the student body is attending 90% or greater, which approximates, chronic absenteeism.
So, Dr. Robin, are you saying that we already do have that kind of breakdown included in these results?
Yes, it's built into the model. It's not on that calculations page I just showed you. There was a reason, and it was because of the nature of the data that it didn't fit into that calculation page, but it is built into the composite model. So it exerts some influence, probably not a ton, but
it's a legit question, because if the numbers we're looking at for the risk our overall school like wide, it would definitely, I mean, I look at this like license plates, like I deal with license plates at work, and there might be like 1,000 license plates that get a no hit from the DMV, but like the top 20 make up 40% of the total.
Yep.
Of no hits. So
There's
you know,
super high
and that's
flyer
like,
utilizers. Yep.
exactly.
That the goal of putting the two different looks in was to address that. So for each school, their risk score takes both of those factors into account. It's actually an average of that continuous and that categorical variable. That was the way I tried to address it anyway.
So I'm going to interject, if you don't mind. I'm going to interject and try and bring a little bit of closure because it is 7:37, and look at what our next steps are, and then establish when our next meeting will be, and then what that agenda will be. And so right now we have Dr. Robbins' work. He's got a few things to fine tune, and then that will go to President Savage and the conversion to a database format. So that's number one. And then we'll look at a composite range in order to see what scenarios we might want to move forward or look at, and then narrow the number that we feel would be most equitable. And I probably need a little clarification because that was the language that was used. And then once we get a narrowing of, say, down to 20, top 10, whatever the case may be, then we look at the overlay of some of those additional factors that we may not be able to quantify, but that becomes that qualitative conversation. And so from there, and then I know within and this is kind of a sidebar, within the scenarios, President Savage will identify those that intersect with the scenarios that we've already looked at. So those are the things that need to be done. Those are the takeaways from this meeting. And then as we move forward, what would be a reasonable time frame? We do have a board meeting next week. What would be a reasonable time frame for the committee to meet again to see where we are, and then look, because we are going to have to make some adjustments to our community schedule. We're going to have to make some adjustments there based on the work. And so the question that I have is, do we want to meet one day early next week prior to the board meeting, or is that not enough time? Because I'm not sure what the time frame will be in order to do this background work before we come together again. And then I guess for clarification purposes, are we looking at having at our next committee meeting a bank of 10, 20 scenarios that, based on the rules, they fit the rules, and now we need to put that qualitative eye on there because we've looked as quantitatively as possible. So that's a lot. So I'll go back. First of all, do we want to have a meeting before we have the board meeting? Do we want to meet Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday of next week?
I liked your framing of all that. I want to start with what has to happen before we meet next, and what's feasible for Dr. Robin. I think his work was the key things he had to do, if I recall correctly. And by the way, I can't see you guys. Something's up with my connectivity. I'm seeing black screens for the key speakers. I don't know what's going on with that, but whatever. Hopefully, wait, I'm unpinning everybody. Maybe it was just because I had you pinned. Yes, when I unpin you, you're back. Okay, what can I say? Dr. Robin was going to do the work to figure out if there's a school by school differential in survival ratio. That's a really critical one. And he was going to double check the dual data. Was there any other data that you needed to revisit, Dr. Robin, to get the core of the model working?
I don't think so. No, there are just a couple of tweaks. Like I said, I'm going to check everything over give it a tune-up one more time before we move forward.
Perfect. And I may find things as I make the conversion too. I may go like, oh wait, this seems weird. Why is this? And then I can just check with you. So that.
And did we agree that we were going to increase the weight or the percent of the risk scores?
I think we decided we were going to take a look first on how it played out if we tried to minimize the range to zero, so that everything got 100% weight, right? So that it was as if you weighted everything was equally important and all important. And see if we can make it happen. If we can't, then we may have to give on something, right? This is sort of like, let's see if we can have our dream scenario. And if we can't have our dream scenario, what sacrifices are we going to have to make, right? I mean, if we could lay out our dreamish, the perfect dream scenario would be perfect equity on every metric, perfectly aligned enrollment, and nobody would have to change schools at all, right? We know that's not going to work, right? Some of those things have to give. The first one is going to be got to move, right? And so we're going to see what's the least give we have to give to get what we want, I think is the way we have to look at it. And the answer to how little we have to give will depend on what the outcomes are. And we won't know that till we've run the scenarios. Okay. So back to what has to happen. Dr. Robin has to do that. I have to do my work, which, because it's modeled on what I did previously, is not terrifying me in terms of the amount of work, but I certainly need at least a few days to do that. Just because, like, I do actually have, a professional life as well. This is actually my volunteer gig. So I will need a little bit of time to do that. So I don't know that a meeting early next week is possible, is what I'm trying to get to if we want to have. Thank you. Everybody say hi to Myers 6th grade. You got to come closer. Hi. Myers 6th grade's bringing me dinner. So that I guess raises some concern for me that it's not conceivable. And I don't know how long it will take you, Dr. Robin, to do your bit and get me started.
I could have everything to you next weekend, probably, Monday's a holiday. Middle of the week next week, I could probably have a clean file with the updates. This is assuming I'm able to get clarification on duals. Otherwise, it is what it is. But I expect to be successable in that regard.
So that takes us to the week of the 24th. Now, availability, Mondays, Wednesdays. I know that Marina, what was your day that you're out? No Wednesdays.
I don't have, no, not anymore. I'm good.
Okay, so are we thinking tonight is Wednesday night, and I know that that's been a pretty good night. So are we good with next Wednesday? Not next Wednesday, the one coming up after the holiday, Wednesday the 26th.
Yes, although point of clarification, today is Thursday.
Oh.
That's a good thing.
See, I need one more day this week. I'm just saying, I need one more day this week. And cabinet members are looking at me like I am absolutely out of my mind. Do not add another day to this week. So, and I'm sitting here, I need to add another day. So we're looking at Wednesday the 26th for our next meeting, 6 o'clock.
Yep.
That works?
If we can do slightly later, that's better for me, but I can.
6:30?
I would love 6:30 if that works for others.
If that works, we can do 6:30.
Thank you, everybody.
No problem.
And we're looking still doing virtual, or we're going to assess closer to that?
Let's go ahead and plan. Let's go ahead and plan virtual. But if things are better, then we can do a hybrid option like we've done in the past, where we have, those who want to come in person and then those who want to attend virtually. So we have our marching orders, and then we'll be able to share out on the 26th the results of where we are. Thank you all so very much, Dr. Robin. Thank you so very much, President Savage. Thank you. And I want to thank all the committee members. Dorian, you have a question?
Before we end, should we be having a conversation at some point about the bigger picture of the schedule going forward? I know we're way behind where we wanted to be.
We will have to do that once we have the information, which is what I said, that we're going to need to take an opportunity to review that. I was saying that earlier, but we can't do that now because we don't see the details of the information. Yeah. But absolutely, we will revisit that calendar.
Great.
So, all right, everybody, thank you so very much and have a good night, okay?
So, good to see everyone. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.